Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to those of you here live and to those who will enjoy this in video replay. Thank you so much for joining us in this presentation. We thank the Princeton Preservation Group for hosting. We have gratitude to our Buddhist teachers for their guidance, to our funders for the Tsum Preservation Project. The Firebird Foundation and the Pema Chodron Foundation are our funders, and to our international conservation colleagues. I am proud to include our co-authors. Coming from Delhi, Aishwarya Mehta, and coming from Nepal is Bharat Raj Bhattacharya. They both worked on site on this project in remote Tsum with Treasure Caretaker Training team. You can see them on site documenting TsaTsa in the remote Tsum, Nepal. Let me introduce you to Treasure Caretaker Training. Treasure Caretaker Training, or TCT, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to working closely with nuns and monks for the preservation of Buddhist treasures in monasteries and communities. Preservation projects and workshops are ongoing in Nepal, India, China, North America, and Australia, as well as in Western Dharma centers, museums, and universities. Our website is created in direct response to questions from monks and nuns and their community members. It is written with examples and images from monasteries. TCT, or Treasure Caretaker Training, was actually the first to apply the risk assessment model to preservation of monastery treasures. We teach risk assessment on site. For example, I was just in Yushu, China, on the Tibetan Plateau by invitation from 2 monasteries, and their understanding of the risk assessment approach and the need for documentation was immediate and impressive. I first began working in documentation and preservation in India and Nepal in 1970. That's 54 years ago. I visited the conservation lab of the National Museum to find only men dressed in suits doing scientific experiments, no conservation. But since then, I've worked many places on site and feel really comfortable, as do our TCT team. Rachen Nunnery, the site of this project, is located at 3,240 meters in remote Nepal in the Gorkha district. You can get there by trekking for 3 to 6 days, depending on your trekking skills and altitude resistance, or you can arrive by helicopter. This is the pilot's radar in the helicopter. You can see it's largely yellow and red, which means danger. Rachen Nunnery was established in 1936 by the Bhutanese Lama Zopa Rinpoche. In 2005, the current Zopa Rinpoche requested Lama Zopa Rinpoche to care for the nuns and its community. The nunnery currently has 36 nuns, from very, very young to very, very old. They study Buddhism and meditate all day. It's quite remote, and the wind is flying over the mountains towards you at all times. It's a very beautiful and rugged place. Conservators who work with sacred art work with the cultural heritage treasures from diverse world religions. This is why the discussion about sacred art is so interesting, because sacred is a definition that's intangible. Yet, as conservators, especially on this project, we're dealing with tangible objects, things that are made of atoms and molecules. A big question for people on a very personal level and a professional level is what defines something in a material object as being sacred. Is there a line up to which it's not sacred and then it becomes sacred? Or is it something in its physical makeup that makes it sacred? What kind of ceremony or whom can transform it into being sacred? Can something happen to a treasure during its history that makes it either sacred or that erases its sacred qualities? These are questions we consider all during our work on site. As with most nonprofit projects, this one was 3 years in development. We began with a visit to Rachen Nunnery with Geshe Tenzin Nyima, the scholar and administrator, a truly kind and wise person. On site for that visit was our major funder for the Tsum Preservation Project, charity, seen here in the nunnery, from the Firebird Foundation, which also funded our TCT preservation work in 2 small village temples the year before. Thank you to charity and to the Firebird Foundation. As with many nonprofit projects, we begin with a video. This is the video to show you how it looked before we began work. Geshe-la requested TCT, our team, to live in the nunnery itself, work every day for 3 weeks in the historic Anigompa, the original nunnery meditation hall, on preservation of the original over 800 TsaTsa. In fact, there were over 1,000 of them. Our core team for this project included Craig Lewis, who's a journalist, who's also skilled in basic conservation, Virat, who's here, our Newari scholar and translator, Craig Deller, an American conservator, and Aishwarya, our arts administrator from Delhi, who's also a co-author. But every day, Geshe Tenzin Nyima worked with us, hands-on, setting the pace with his stellar work ethic. And his senior nuns also worked with us. Most of the other nuns were in 2 weeks of deep retreat practice. I'd like to point out that we are wearing gloves and masks, not because of COVID concerns, but because of the dust particles and pigment particles on the TsaTsa and in the Anigompa. These are 2 of the community members that joined us also. One is our mountain guide, Tenzin, and the other is an artist who came from Kathmandu to learn preservation techniques. TCT, Treasure Caretaker Training, takes very seriously the training part. In other words, training is what we do. So we don't just go as conservators and do things. We definitely are sharing our knowledge. You're asking, what are TsaTsas? TsaTsas are molded clay votive tablets. You can see them on the left over the nun. They're commonly found in traditional Buddhist temples. They hold spiritual blessings and are created as a form of meditation practice themselves. They are traditionally made from earth with blessed substances mixed into the clay or inserted into the TsaTsas. The TsaTsas themselves are not flammable. The TsaTsas in the Anigompa, as you can see, they vary with age, some being very, very old, decades old, and others even centuries older. The iconography of these TsaTsas features Avalokiteshvara, representing the compassion of the Buddha as the central figure. Manjushri, symbolizing the knowledge of the Buddha, and Vajrapani, representing Buddha's power. They are positioned at the bottom proper right and left of the central figure, respectively. The primary goal of our conservation treatment was to extend the lifespan of these TsaTsas with minimal intervention, minimal. As a living temple, where daily rituals are being performed twice a day, the preservation plan for the Onigompa was meticulously designed to maintain its sanctity, ensuring proper care and handling in sacred objects, and several times a day, a nun would come to fill the water offering bowls and light butter lamps. From a risk assessment point of view, burning butter lamps in close proximity to silk offering scarves called katas creates a real risk hazard for fire. They were left unattended all night. During certain days of the lunar calendar, the entire small chapel was filled with butter lamps. Although the windows are closed and there are a few drafts of wind, there are rats running around which could easily knock over a butter lamp, creating a raging fire. Also, if you've been in this part of Asia, there are always some issues with electrical connections. Documentation. We did an overall pre and post documentation in situ. One of the conservators wanted to have a documentation examination report, as we do in museums, done for each TsaTsa, each of the 1,000. However, the head of the monastery took over the organizational process of the project, which is good, and furthermore would not allow any numbers to be written on the sacred objects. This is the beauty and strength of community-based projects. And often those who live with and worship with the sacred art have a process of treatment that is both respectful and effective to begin with. It's so important that conservators on site are adaptive enough to welcome this. Our documentation showed overall before and after location documentation coverage in video and stills, and also specific details for some TsaTsas that received extensive stabilization treatment. Our approach is respectful of traditional usage and centuries-old traditional techniques, and we introduce documentation, we introduce risk assessment, and how to prevent damage to help preserve traditional and blessed sacred art for future generations. This is Bharat, a co-author, and the Geshe planning the approach. The TsaTsas and the shelves had not been cleaned for decades. You can see here the variety of TsaTsas. Some seem to be more recent paint, some are quite old. They were jammed into the shelves and caused flaking and cracking damage to each other, especially as they moved around during earthquakes and earth shakes. The substances on the shelves was hand removed, and the live insects, centipedes and spiders, were carefully let out of the premises. And these are poisonous big black spiders and definitely poisonous large centipedes. There's a no-kill policy in the area of Tsum, so each large insect that had been living there with its ancestors through generations had to be hand-carried out and placed outside. We also found offerings on the shelves that included prayer flags, pictures of teachers, candy, and other substances, which were taken outside and offered on the hillside. The shelves were then thoroughly vacuum cleaned and wiped down, mostly by the head of the nunnery, Geshe-la himself, who did most of the cleaning. Here you see Craig Deller cleaning. But the Geshe wanted to do most of the cleaning so that he could save every insect that he encountered. These are the shelves after cleaning and before replacement of the TsaTsas. The scope of treatment was to stabilize the condition and to remove accretions as necessary. You can see they were quite dusty. When we could, when weather permitted, we worked outside. Both good for better light, but also for our lungs, even with masks and gloves. Everyone worked very carefully and respectfully. This is Aishwarya, a co-author, doing some simple consolidation treatment on one of the TsaTsas. For those conservators who are going to ask, it's 2 to 5% dilute isinglass. And there's Aishwarya with the young nuns who adored her. She's teaching them some things on our computer. TsaTsas are not two-dimensional objects. Each one is a sculpture in itself, and a sacred art sculpture at that. We kept that in mind the entire time. Post-treatment, the TsaTsas were placed on the shelves in an entirely different configuration, selected by the geshe, with fewer on each shelf and according to the color scheme and nuances in the iconography. Here I am arranging the TsaTsas according to color scheme and iconography, according to the wishes of the geshe, who then placed them back on the shelves in a different order. I'd like to mention that when I go to a site, I leave behind my coat, my hat, my hiking boots, my sleeping bag, and mostly everything else. Here's the geshe looking really happy as he replaced the TsaTsas in a certain order back on the shelves after they had been cleaned and the TsaTsas had been stabilized. He was sincerely pleased with this. And again, he was with us every day. As well as TsaTsa, this historic Anigompa had textile banners, similar to tankas, but they're sewn together. They had been covered with heavy plastic for decades. You could not see what was behind the plastic. So as you entered the Anigompa, all you really saw was some dark and occlusive plastic. The geshe requested that we take the plastic-covered banners down to clean them. Here is Bharat, one of the co-authors, standing on a table, carefully taking down the plastic-covered banners. In fact, the plastic was very deteriorated. It was probably not good quality to begin with. We did cleaning and mending of the textile banner inside, and the geshe will decide whether to hang them up again or to place them elsewhere in the nunnery. That is Craig Lewis, our Buddhist Store Global journalist, who also worked with us every day, a true team member. And that's Aishwarya, our co-author, cleaning the banners outside. On the left, you also see our mountain guide. You're required to have a mountain guide with you at that altitude and in that remote area. He was excellent and also worked with us every day. We respectfully handed back the clean banners to the geshe, and you could see by his beaming smile that he was really happy with it. Another project we did there, in accordance with the geshe's wishes, was that a window had been replaced with more shelving for more TsaTsas, since there were over 1,000, and since originally they were really jammed together on the shelves, causing each other harm. So one of our volunteer team members was an actual artist who was tasked by the geshe with copying the older colored paint on wood and making it exactly the same so that the shelves would blend in. We asked him to duplicate the painting in the surrounding shelves. I asked him to tone down his primary colors so that his painting would match the older painting on the shelves. However, he wanted bright painting. He thought it would look better, even though we asked him again and again while he was painting to please tone it down. He had actually not been trained to tone anything down subtly as a painter. This is his work in progress and the paints he used. You can see his section of painting on your left, and it's quite bright, and the original traditional historic painting on the right, and there's really a disparity there, and the geshe was not happy. So the geshe requested that I repaint it to make it look older. Well, we're conservators, so I did tone it down. I spent quite a while toning it down, and this is in the middle of my process. Of course, as conservators, we'd like it so that if you were very close, you could see what was new and what was old. But honestly, as you walk into the temple, and if you're standing even in front of it, admiring the TsaTsas or doing worship, you can't tell the difference in the end. And the geshe requested this and was quite happy with it. We can have discussion on this if you wish. Conservators love to do in-painting. When we finished our 3 weeks living in the nunnery and working on over 1,000 tsatsas, our team was gifted these cast synthetic tsatsas, which were painted gold and blessed. And we love them. They didn't break or chip in our suitcases flying home either. This is our team after we cleaned up our work supplies in the temple and brought it back to its original state. You can see that the banners covered with plastic are no longer there, and that the tsatsas you see around are cleaned and tidy and placed according to the wishes of the geshe. The boxes you see on the over the shoulder of Virat, one of our co-authors, are texts that they're going to distribute. Let's go around the room. These are some images of how it looked after the geshe placed the tsatsas, the cleaned and stabilized tsatsas, back on the shelves. The community was very happy with this. On the left, you can see how it looked before, and on the right, with the smiling geshe-la, you can see how they are now. Treasure Caretaker Training knows the importance of temperature, relative humidity, and light levels. So almost everywhere we go, we leave behind little older quality hobo data loggers that were gifted to Treasure Caretaker Training by Conserve and other museums that had replaced these older models with current models. And so we leave behind both the software to read them out and a data logger everywhere we go. You might be interested in what the data logger showed us while we were there working. We thought there'd be fluctuation at night, but the building's walls are so thick that actually there was not much fluctuation. We're almost done with our presentation, and there'll be plenty of time for questions with me and the two co-authors, Virat and Aishwarya. But I'd also like to point you to an amazing set of such well-written articles that were published by Buddhist Door Net by Craig Lewis, who was embedded in our team. He actually did conservation every day for 2 of our projects. His writing is sensitive and informative, and his illustrations are beautiful. He actually did an interview of the geshe, which talked a lot about our work there at his nunnery, at Rachen Nunnery. I do recommend you read Craig Lewis's articles on our work there. I'd like to end with a quote directly from Geshe Tenzin Nyima and his nuns. Treasure Caretaker Training team served Rachen Nunnery very well for more than 3 weeks. You preserved 1,000 Chenrezi TsaTsa and some tankas very nicely. So we, all the nuns, are very happy for that. Thank you very much from our heart. Geshe Tenzin Nyima. I'd like now to stop sharing my screen and to introduce the co-authors, Virat and Aishwarya. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne. So co-authors, welcome. You should be able to unmute yourselves. Oh, here we are.
Hello, Virat. Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Congratulations for being with us in the middle of the night. Thank you.
Most welcome. I'm very glad to be in the presentation.
And Aishwarya?
Yeah. Hello, Anne. Good evening, everybody.
So if anyone would like to ask questions, especially of Virat and Aishwarya, we would welcome that.
Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, you do have the ability to unmute yourselves. So I invite you to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you're more comfortable, you can type it in the chat and I am happy to read it for you. Whatever works for you. Gary, I see you've unmuted. Would you like to take the first question?
Anne, first, thank you. It was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for your, obviously you did a lot of preparation for it, and I appreciate the time you put into it. I have a question about working at that altitude. For those of the team that do not normally live at that altitude, did you experience any difficulties?
Thank you, Gary. First of all, I'd like to also thank Bharat and Aishwarya, who are equal co-authors of this presentation. Thank you, but we all are the authors. They put a lot of effort into it as well. About the altitude, that is a real issue, I have to say. Now, some of us are not affected by the altitude, or we take the basic altitude medication, which is has very few side effects. But some people absolutely cannot breathe. And there's really no predicting who. For example, I just last week returned from, as I said, working in Yushu, which is on the Tibetan plateau, which is much, much higher than at Tsum. And many people get off the airplane and need oxygen. And the hotels have oxygen and the taxi cabs have oxygen. But honestly, it didn't bother me. Everyone was amazed. And there's absolutely no predicting how it bothers you. At the least, you feel a bit tired and want to take some naps. And some people are fine working, but they're not that great when they have to trek up the mountainside to go to the next village because there are no roads there. So Gary, it's really hard to predict, but altitude sickness is a real thing. So it's important when choosing team members to have a discussion about that. So thank you. It's a good point.
I have a follow-up to that, and that is that given that there's less oxygen at that altitude, is there also less oxidation going on of artifacts at that level?
That's a really interesting question. We're going to address that, the three of us, when we do a scholarly paper for a conservation conference. I would say that partially yes, but there's other conditions that are far more harsh than other places. For example, there is always the freezing cold wind, even when the sun is out, and there's no heat. And the sun can be harsh, there's very little ozone layer. We're really up on the top of the Himalayas, and there's no clean drinking water. And so anything you use, for cleaning, you have to be careful with. So there are other considerations. So that is a really good technical point, and I'm glad you brought it up. I'd say that could be definitely, but there are other concerns. For example, a rat running across and knocking over the butter lamp, and then a kata offering scarf will catch on fire and the whole thing will burn down. So yeah, there are a lot of considerations. I think the fact that there might be less oxidation is something we didn't really go into because we were busy with the other considerations. But thank you. We're going to look into that more for our scholarly paper. Thanks.
I'm going to jump in and relay a question from the chat. It says, because of the chronic power shortages in Nepal, was there an issue with electricity? I noticed there were ring lights to help inside, and there was the vacuum.
I'd like to Bharat or Aishwarya to feel free to answer that question.
Yeah, actually, we did not encounter any power shortages up there in the remote valley. So that was very helpful. And the ring lights were used only to make the documentation more efficient.
Okay, great. Thank you. I see somebody has their hand raised. If you'd like to go ahead, please jump in.
Yeah. Hey, first and foremost, Aishwarya and Bharat and Anne, congratulations on the paper. It looks fantastic. I did have a question about the physical objects, the TsaTsas themselves. What are they made of? It looks like some sort of a mold-made process. Is that fired clay? I'm wondering first and foremost how they're made, and secondly, are they still being produced on site now, or is it more focused on maintaining the objects that are already there?
Bharat, would you answer this, please?
Yes, thank you for your question. And these TsaTsas are traditionally made out of clay, and they are molded, as you guessed it right. So the TsaTsas we worked on, they are made from the clay, and these clays are brought from another village, from the another side of the Himalayas, because they wanted the good quality clay. And while using this clay, they would put the mantras, they write the mantras, and they roll it and put it inside. So this is how it's made, and it is not cooked. So it's uncooked clay molded structures. And still today, as and mentioned earlier, we also got some pieces. So these TsaTsas that we work on were made 8 years ago when the monastery was formed. And still now they make the TsaTsas, but nowadays they are using like white pastel Paris and stuff to make the TsaTsas. So it is being carried out, but the material they use has changed according to the time.
Thank you so much. And maybe one more question for Aishwarya, if I could. Oh, go ahead, Anne.
I'd
Sorry.
like to add a few things. That it's considered a meritorious practice to make these, and they're still being made elsewhere in traditional ways with clay, but also with substances, either robes or body substances from great teachers or from texts, not just inserted, but the TsaTsa materials themselves are considered very sacred. And so they are still elsewhere being made in the traditional way, and it's very meritorious to make them as well, an act of devotion.
Awesome. And my last question was, we saw some of them being painted, some of them not being painted. Was there a process behind determining, which should get restoration, which should be left as is? Was that perhaps based on, antiquity, or what was the thought on the monastery side for that?
Actually, we tried to take care of each and every sasa. That's how we sort of got to the count that there were more than 1,000. So we worked on each and every sasa.
And yes, in fact, to further to the question, we made no changes. In other words, if one was old enough, really the older ones were not painted at all, and some had some metallic paint, and some were painted according to the iconography. We made absolutely no changes according to that, and that was agreed upon before with the geshe.
Understood. So the only painting that was done was for the shelves themselves. The actual TsaTsas were remained untouched, or only conserved, I should say.
Well, a few of the team members wanted to try in painting. So one or two of the TsaTsas that were severely cracked, the geshe allowed me to do some in painting instruction just on those. But otherwise, we did no in painting. Really, we were there to stay clean and stabilize with great respect.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate all your time. Thank you, guys.
Here is another question in the chat. It says, is the threat from the rats knocking over the butter lamps considered during the threat evaluations? Would the situation be changed considering the sacred nature of the setting?
Aishwarya or Bharat, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. And one of the alternatives would be to have a dedicated space to light butter lamps further away from the sacred katas, maybe a space right outside the sacred shrine room where devotees would offer their respects and place their butter lamps.
Okay, anybody? Oh, here's another question that just popped into the chat. Has anyone thought of getting some new cat residents to join the nunnery?
What about getting some cats? Aishwarya or Bharat?
And the monastery already has cats. The thing is, like any kind of animal could pose threats in those kind of condition. Just a small talking from a big or small animal, let the butter lamp fall, and it's very risky. But since it has been the traditional setting always, unless the nunnery really wants to do something about it, we really can't do anything about the butter lamps because those are offerings, and it has been kept or like been practiced same way. So Only the option would be to have the butter lamps outside, which would prevent from the fire, which is prevent from the smoking and everything. But it's all upon the nunneries, and we did suggest them.
Okay. Anyone else in the audience want to unmute and ask a question? Okay, Gary, I'll turn it over to you. Any last questions from you?
I'd like to invite those of you who would like to be a regular member of the Princeton Preservation Group to go to our website. Our dues are a modest $5 a year. And our next meeting will be in early December on the conservation of plastic. So if you would like to join us again, we'd be glad to see you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much to our speakers. For those of you who are here tonight, if you enjoyed this program, and I know you did because there's so much wonderful feedback in the chat. If you enjoyed the program, let your friends know that it will soon be available on Princeton Preservation Group's YouTube channel for free. So keep an eye out for that. Anne, any closing thoughts from you before we conclude?
I'd like to thank, again, our Buddhist teachers for their guidance, our funders that make it all possible, and also our Treasure Caretaker Training team members very much for their hard work in often difficult circumstances. And I would definitely want to encourage everyone who's here tonight and those that watch in the future to follow our work on social media. And also, please feel free to contact us if you have any wish to join us in the future, because our work is ongoing in many countries. And as I said, currently have projects upcoming in Australia, in China on the Tibetan Plateau, in Nepal, in India, and definitely in North America. And we're about to start a 3-week training program on preservation of Paba and Tanka in Kathmandu with one of our Treasure Caretaker team members, Patricia Smithen. So this is ongoing, and we'd love for you to join us, whoever you are and whatever you have to offer. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.